something to think about.
Shalom and greetings. We welcome you to this week's Sabbath message. This week's Sabbath message is entitled, Scripture Identifies the King Behind the Secular Kingdoms/Nations. Scripture identifies the king behind the secular kingdoms/nations. So let us first understand, since cities, kingdoms, and nations were first formed, they have attracted people by and with their glory, splendor, and wealth. So from the beginning of time, cities, kingdoms, and nations have attracted people by their glory, splendor, and wealth. So fast forward to today, and there is no change. People are still drawn to cities, kingdoms, and nations by and with their grandeur, beauty, treasures, and opulence. So, throughout this episode, we will classify and use cities, kingdoms, and nations as one and the same. So they all mean the same. Cities, kingdoms, and nations, they're all one and the same. And this will be explained and validated as we go through this message. There should be no surprise that today, the most superb, magnificent, and luxurious cities, kingdoms, and nations are also the most affluent. There should be no surprise that the superb, the magnificent, and luxurious are the most affluent cities, kingdoms, and nations. Now, as we stated at the start, it has been this way since cities, kingdoms, and nations were first formed. The most wonderful, brilliant, and exclusive cities, kingdoms, and nations attract people. That's what they do. They attract people. But, more specifically, the richest people. So these cities, kingdoms, and nations, these brilliant and exclusive, wonderful cities, kingdoms, and nations, they attract people, but not just people, but more specifically, the richest people. Those that have been successful in the acquisition of wealth. Sadly, nothing has changed over the years. This still holds true today. Forbes' World's Billionaires list for 2022 states there are 2,668 of them billionaires. 87 fewer than a year ago. Their worth, all 2,668 billionaires, they're worth a collective $12.7 trillion. These 2,668 people collectively are worth $12.7 trillion. But get this, 400 billion less than in 2021. Just over 53% of those who made the ranks of that 2,668 are citizens. Over 53% of that number who made the ranks are citizens of either the United States or China. The U.S. leads the pack of the 2,668 billionaires with 724 billionaires. So the U.S. leads the pack. In total, a greater 724 billionaires in total. Greater China, which includes Hong Kong and Macau, boasts a total of 698 billionaires. So between the US and China, they have over 53% of all of the billionaires in the world live in those two nations, those two kingdoms. India is third with 237 billionaires, followed by Germany with 136 and Russia with 117 billionaires. Something to think about, something to think about. There are 195 nations, kingdoms in the world today. 195. The 5 nations, kingdoms that we just mentioned of the US, China, India, Germany, and Russia actually make up over 71% of all the billionaires in the world. Those 5 out of 195 nations, those 5 make up over 71% of all the billionaires in the world and make up over 40%. Those 5, again, just these 5, make up over 40% of the world's population. But these 5 nations, kingdoms, make up less than 3% of the total nations of the world. Get that? Further validating that extraordinary, fascinating, and financially prosperous nations, kingdoms are still enticing people as a flame continuously entices moths. Understand, these nations, kingdoms attract both those people that are affluent because of their success in the acquisition of wealth, as well as attracting those people desiring after wealth, willing to do whatever it takes to become wealthy. So let us allow Scripture to pine in on the fascination and potential dangers. So we're going to allow Scripture to pine in on the fascination and, in addition to, potential dangers associated with cities, kingdoms, and nations. Now, the first time the word cities is used in the Scripture is in Genesis chapter 13, verse 12. As we examine this Scripture, we will see who dwells in the cities and who does not. So let us read Genesis chapter 13, verse 12. Genesis chapter 13, verse 12 reads, Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan. Hear what I'm saying? Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan. And Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent toward Sodom. Now, just a little backstory here. We know what was happening is that Lot was traveling with his uncle Abram, had a lot of cattle, and there was a strife over the land because they had so much cattle and water. So Abram told his so there wouldn't be any issues. Abram told his nephew, "Hey, look, pick out wherever you want to go, and I'll go the rest. I'll go in another direction, and you can take your cattle and all that you have, and so then we won't be competing against one another in a small because since we're all together." Lot, it says, he looked and he was fascinated. He was enticed by the cities. So that's why it says here in Genesis 13:12, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent toward Sodom. Now, Scripture shares that Abram, Yahweh Elohim's representative, is content dwelling, inhabiting the land, just as Yahweh Elohim created it, without any inviting attractions. Remember, it says, and Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan. no enticing, no extravagance, and everyone's content, just inhabiting the land, just as Yahweh Elohim created it. The scripture goes on to say that Lot inhabited the cities of the plain, and moved his tent toward Sodom. Pitched and moved his tent to Sodom. So let us take advantage of this example to now explain and validate cities and kingdoms being one and the same. Remember, we said that nations, cities, kingdoms, they're all one and the same. We're going to use this example to validate cities and kingdoms being one and the same. So let us go to Genesis chapter 14, verse 2, and let us read. Genesis chapter 14, verse 2 reads that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom. Bera is the king of Sodom. And with Bersha, king of Gomorrah. Shinab, king of Admah. And Shemember, king of Zeboim. And the king of Bela, which is Zoar. So Bela is the king of Zoar. Okay? So these what are being identified here, it doesn't call them cities, it doesn't call them nations, it doesn't call them kingdoms. It just says that there were kings, though, over these names: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. They're kings over these places. So notice that the scripture validates cities and kingdoms can be used interchangeably. In Genesis 13:12, the scripture shared Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain. All of those 5 cities are those cities that are in the plain. So we see here that, okay, they're really cities then, even though it doesn't identify that. But let's go a little deeper. So in Genesis 13:12, scripture shared Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and actually called out Sodom. Then in Genesis chapter 14, verse 2, scripture reveals Sodom is a kingdom because it's ruled by the king Bera. Also remember Zoar's king Bela. Let us go and move from just knowing to understanding the scriptural definition of the words, the scriptural definition of the word cities and kingdom. So, one of the definitions used in the Jacinius Hebrew County Lexicon for cities is said to be so called being frequented of people, drawing people coming there. So that's the definition for city, being frequented or drawn by people. That's what identifies a city. If just people are coming there and they're drawn there, much like we saw Lot was drawn to Sodom. He frequented Sodom because he said he pitched his tent towards or to Sodom. Now let us understand the definition of the word kingdom, the scriptural definition of the word kingdom. The definition in the Jacinius Hebrew Chaldee lexicon is, for kingdom, is a country subject to a king. Any country that's subject to a king is called a kingdom. So we've allowed scripture to validate that cities and kingdoms can be used interchangeably. Because in Genesis 14:2 shares kings. Remember we said, and they made war with the kings of these 5 nations. So Genesis 14:2 shares kings rule the cities Sodom, Gomorrah, and Zoar, Zeboim, and Admah. The scriptural definition states a kingdom is subject to a king. So even though these were cities, they're subject to a king, so they also could be identified as kingdoms. So that's why, again, I just want to validate why we're just lumping these all together from a scriptural perspective. We will connect the similarity of a kingdom and a nation a little later. For now, let us look into the potential dangers of cities or kingdoms. Once again, we will allow scripture to shed light on this matter. So let us go to Genesis chapter 18, verses 20 through 21, as well as Genesis chapter 19, verses 4 through 5. And then we're going to go into Genesis chapter 19, verses 10, 13, 15, 17, and 22. So let us read Genesis chapter 18, verse 20. And the Lord Yahweh said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous. Genesis chapter 18, verse 21. I, Yahweh Elohim, will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which has come unto me, and if not, I will know. So in this passage, Yahweh Elohim is speaking and saying, because of the very grievous sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, he will investigate whether or not it is true. Now remember, scripture shared earlier, Lot moved his tent toward or to the city of Sodom. So Yahweh Elohim sends his angels. He doesn't come himself. He says, when he says, I will go down, he actually sends his angels to Lot in the city of Sodom. Because remember, he's going to check out Sodom and Gomorrah. So he sends angels down, and I'm just giving some background here from Genesis 18, 20 and 21, because we're going to pick up in Genesis 19:4. So Yahweh Elohim sends his angels down to Lot in the city of Sodom to see what is happening in this city. So let us skip down now to Genesis 19:4 and pick up there. Genesis chapter 19, verse 4 reads, but before they, those are the angels of the Most High and Lot and his family, but before they laid down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, encircled the house round, both old and young. All the people from every quarter of the city of Sodom. All the men. Genesis chapter 19, verse 5. And they, the men of the city that encircled the house, they called unto Lot and said unto him, where are the men which came into thee this night? It's talking about the angels that the Most High sent to investigate what's going on in the city. So they asked Lot, and they called unto Lot and said unto him, where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. Now again, we've talked about, and it's shared in our book, The Beginning of Scriptural Truth, Volume 1. That word know in the Hebrew actually meaning here, it means to be intimate with, to have relations and intercourse with. So these men, because that's why it was very specific in Genesis 19, verse 4, the men of the city all came out. None of the women, from every quarter. And they, all the men, called and said, bring out the men which came into thee. We want to know them. We want to be intimate with them. We want to be have intercourse with these men that came into you this night. Let's skip down now to Genesis 19, verse 10. But the men, now he's talking about the angelic beings, the men that they were asking about. But the men, are the angels, but the men put forth their hand, because Lot went out between 19:5 and 19:10. He actually went out to talk to the men and plead with them not to do, what they wanted to do. He was going to give them his virgin daughters, but just don't bother these men. But the people weren't hearing him, and they kept pressing closer. So it says in Genesis 19:10, as we skip down, but the men, the angels, put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house to them and shut the door. Genesis chapter 19, verse 11. And they, those angels, smote the men, all those men that were in the city of Sodom, that were at the door of the house with blindness. So the angels smote all the men that were at the door with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door. So they couldn't find the door and try to come in. Genesis chapter 19, verse 12. And the men said unto Lot, the angels said unto Lot, hast thou here any besides? So is there anybody else here that's with you? Son-in-law, and thy sons, and thy daughters, and whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring them out of this place. So the angels are telling them, like, okay, you know, anybody with you that you can come, that you can get to come with you, and whatever you want to take, you got to get them out of this place, though. But get this. Genesis chapter 19, verse 13. For we will destroy this place, because the cry of them is waxing great before the face of the Lord Yahweh. Remember, that's what we read about earlier. And the Lord Yahweh had sent us to destroy it. So, Genesis chapter 19, verse 14. So get this. Remember, in Genesis 19, 12, the angels asked him, so, you know, if you got anybody else here that, you know, would be willing to come with you. So in Genesis 19:14, it says, and Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and said, up, get you out of this place, for the Lord Yahweh will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. They're like, you're crazy. Nothing's going to happen to this great city, this wonderful city. Genesis chapter 19, verse 15. And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, arise, take thy wife and thy two daughters. I guess these two daughters weren't married. We know that they weren't married because they went out, and as you read, you know what happened. So take thy wife and thy two daughters, which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. Let's skip down now to Genesis 19:17. And it came to pass, because in 19:16, it's basically Lot was still trying to mill around, trying to get people to come. They basically just had to grab him and take him out. Because, you know, he was, you know, trying to, oh, come on, you know, come. And it's like, you got to go now. So they take him out of the city. Genesis 19:17. And it came to pass, when they had brought them forth abroad, Lot, his wife, and his two daughters, that he said, the angel, escape for thy life. We're going to destroy this place. Escape for thy life. Look not behind thee, neither stay thou in all the plain. Escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed. They're going to destroy all the cities in that plain. We're going to skip down to Genesis 19:22, because we know in between here, Lot asked, like, I can't make it to the mountains. Let me just go to this small city. Okay. So, and they said, okay. So now Genesis 19:22. Haste thee, escape thither, for I cannot do anything until thou be come thither. Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar. The name of the city was called Zoar. But remember, we saw that Zoar was ruled by Bela, a king. So again, we see cities and kingdoms can be used interchangeably here. Scripture once again validates Scripture that cities and kingdoms can be used interchangeably in the Scripture. Remember, in Genesis chapter 19, verse 22, Scripture states that Zoar is a city. And in Genesis chapter 14, verse 2, shared Bela is the king over Zoar, actually qualifying it as a kingdom. A kingdom is ruled by a king. Anything the king rules is considered a kingdom. In the Genesis chapter 19 account, the scripture gives a vivid picture of the dangers that dwell in the cities. In that 19 account, we see the dangers that dwell in the city. The men coming to Lot's house and wanting to do immoral things. The people so caught up there that his sons-in-laws, that they are like, we're not going anywhere. You're crazy. So it gives a vivid picture of the dangers that dwell in the cities. Both scriptural and secular history give us examples of cities, kingdoms, and nations that were seen as the pinnacle of their day, that were overrun with unrighteousness, ungodly, and wicked actions as well. So both scriptural and secular history has examples of these cities and kingdoms and nations that were seen as the pinnacle of their day. They were the most fabulous, they were the most luxurious, they were the most opulent of their day. But they were overrun with unrighteousness, as we saw there in Sodom. The wicked and immoral acts that they wanted to do, ungodly and wicked actions. The website, www.tribunesandtriumphs.org, if you go there, it is under reason why the Roman Empire fell, decline in morals. So this is where I'm pulling this from. So it has this to say, this website and this particular article has this to say about the fall of Rome. It says, a decline in morals, especially in the rich upper classes and the emperors, had a devastating impact on the Romans. So get this. The decline in moral, they say, especially in the upper class and the emperors, really had the devastating impact on Romans. Immoral and promiscuous sexual behavior, including adultery and orgies. Emperors such as Tiberius kept groups of young boys for his pleasure. Incest by Nero, who also had a male slave castrated so he could take him as his wife. Elagabalus, who forces a Vestal virgin into marriage. Commodus, with his harems of concubines, enraged Romans by sitting in the theater dressed in a woman's garments. The decline in morals also affected the lower classes and slaves. So again, that's why I wanted to point this out, that it says that the decline in morals, especially in the rich upper classes and the emperors, had the devastating impact. Because now we see that the decline in morals of those also affected the lower classes and even slaves. Religious festivals such as Saturnalia and Bacchanali, where sacrifices, ribald, vulgar songs, lewd acts, and sexual promiscuity were practiced. Bestiality and other lewd and sexual implicit acts were exhibited in the Colosseum arena. They were actually exhibited in the Colosseum arena to amuse the mob. Brothels and forced prostitution flourished. Widespread gambling on the chariot races and gladiator combats. Massive consumption of alcohol. The sadistic cruelty towards both man and beast in the arena. This is what they're saying. This was the why the Roman Empire fell. Decline in morals. Now, another resource, the Bible Blender newsletter, has this to say about why civilizations fail throughout history. It goes on to say, throughout history, great civilizations have come and gone, with the end of one great civilization often overlapping the beginning of a new great civilization. Great nations, get this now, great nations cease to exist in one of three ways. Great nations cease to exist in one of three ways. One, they may be slowly absorbed and assimilated into another, more thriving civilization. Two, they may be forcefully conquered by another nation. But get this third one. Three, they may slowly but methodically degenerate into a collapsed state. So now it goes on to say here in the Bible Blender newsletter, in many cases, the first two causes, the assimilation into a more thriving or the conquering of another nation, the first two often follow a long period of slow, drawn out degeneration of moral values. So the reason why they're assimilated into a more thriving nation, or the reason why they're forcefully conquered, is because of this long period of slow, drawn out degeneration of moral values. Had that not happened, they wouldn't be assimilated into a more thriving, or they wouldn't be conquered. It's this long, slow period drawn out degeneration of moral values. Those first two. Now, the third one, and sadly, I just see so many similarities of the nation of the United States today, and this is just very disturbing. So the third case, a slow degeneration, it says a decline in moral values is always present. So these are the three ways that the great nations cease to exist. The first two we talked about, the assimilation and the conquest. The third case, a slow degeneration. And it says a decline in moral values is always present. The Bible Blender newsletter goes on to say, an abundance of riches leads to indulgences as the religious and moral framework begins to break down. So an abundance of riches. Now, let's stop and pause here a minute just to do a sanity check if we were paying attention. The United States leads all nations in the world with billionaires. An abundance of riches leads to indulgences as the religious and moral framework begins to break down. So now we have religions and religious leaders endorsing and backing people that are doing immoral and unrighteous things. We see the morality of just people in general being able to be more accommodating and accepting to things. Break down. The framework is breaking down. The Bible Blender goes on to say, an abundance of riches leads to indulgences as the religious and moral framework begins to break down. The great accomplishments achieved by the society lead to an abundance of riches, which, get this, ultimately leads to the decline of morality. The abundance of riches ultimately leads to the decline of morality. Get this. Immigrants, eager to experience the success of the empire, migrate to the area. Remember, we said it attracts both people, those very affluent and wealthy and those that are seeking wealth. So immigrants, eager to experience the success of the empire, migrate to the area, introducing different customs. Some prove beneficial to their new society, and introducing different religions, some in direct opposition to the current established religion. and diluting the labor pool. With luxuries obtained and all desires fulfilled, carnal indulgences soon follow. So with luxuries obtained and all desires fulfilled, carnal indulgences soon follow. Morals break down and an obsession with sex and violence takes hold. Wow. Man, I mean, this sounds so, present today. Citizens see the degradation of morals as an emancipation from the stringent constraints that restrict their behavior. Like, you can't make me wear a mask. I have my rights. I can carry a gun. You can't be constricting me. The decline in morals is often, get this now, this is critical here. The decline in morals is often slow and subtle and unrecognized by the civilization. It's very slow and subtle, so it's unrecognized. It doesn't happen in a bang. It's over years, maybe even over decades. Greed and selfishness, it goes on to say, leads to laziness. It says over time, the rich and poor become greedy, selfish, and indulgent. I got to read this again so we really get the picture, because if you think about it, we see this today. Over time, the rich and poor, this kind of sounds like an oxymoron, become greedy. The poor become even greedy, selfish, and self-indulgent. The rich and poor become greedy, selfish, and self-indulgent. With morals in decline, the self-centered rich and poor, the self-centered, self-indulgent, selfish, the self-indulgent, the self-centered rich and poor alike begin to take advantage of the system. With the rich, get this again, seeking unfair tax advantages and government favor, while the poor, understand this too, take unfair advantage of freely available social benefits. With all their needs met, them taking advantage of these things, taking advantage of the system, and all their needs are met, they become lazy, leading to declines in productivity and a stifling of innovation. So let us take this opportunity to now connect kingdoms and nations and why we consider them one and the same. Remember, we grew from just knowing and understanding cities and kingdoms can be used interchangeably in the scripture, and that the scriptural definition for kingdom was a country subject to a king. So let us grow from just knowing and understanding both scripturally and secularly that nations, including today's nations, are subject to a king. The king of nations is not necessarily a person, but more an entity that lures people into subjection and indebtedness. Once again, we will allow scripture to give us some insight. So let us go to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6 and verse 24. And let us read. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24 reads, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other." Yeshua goes on to say, ye cannot serve God, Elohim, and Mammon. Now, this passage of scripture shares how the entity entices people into believing they can be subject to both Elohim, God, and to Mammon. It entices them, like the cities, like the kingdoms, like the nations. It's enticing. So let us understand the scriptural definition of Mammon. Because he says you can't, we already know who Elohim is. We know who that is. But let us understand the scriptural definition. It says you cannot serve God, Elohim, and Mammon. So what is Mammon? So let us understand the scriptural definition of Mammon. It is the personification and deification, adoration of wealth. That's what mammon is. That you deify, you adore, that's what you, that makes you, that's your personification is wealth. All those that just want to be wealthy. So, let us go and move from just knowing to understanding what this scripture is revealing. It is warning that people cannot serve both God Elohim and the wealth, treasures, and luxuries of the entity, the king. You can't serve both. The scripture shares, and we have seen, people will choose to love or subject themselves to God Elohim or the entity, the king of the nations, and disregard or despise the other. We will allow scripture to corroborate that the riches, opulence, and grandeurs of the kingdoms, nations that people choose to love are of and from the entity, the king, as well as, and in addition to, the futility of all of that, the futility of it. So let us go to the Gospel of Matthew now, chapter 16, verse 26, and let us read. Again, Yeshua speaking. It reads, Matthew 16, 26. For what is a man profited? What is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world? Key in on that word world. If he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul. Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? So let us go from just knowing to truly understanding the scriptural definition of the word world. What does it profit a man? What is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world? So now we're going to go and move from just knowing to truly understanding the scriptural definition of that word world used in this passage of scripture. The Vine's Expository Dictionary defines the word world used in this passage of scripture as the sum of temporal possessions. Remember we said the futility of it. The sum of temporal, meaning short-lived, possessions. And it references the Gospel of Matthew chapter 16, verse 26. This makes it very clear that Yeshua is speaking of people gaining and obtaining all the overindulgences of the entity that they have subjected and indebted themselves to this king. For them attaining all the overindulgences. Yeshua goes on to reveal that there is no profit in any of the temptations of the entity. There's no profit in any of the things that he shows, the splash, the flash, the glitter, because the entity cannot save your soul. I'm going to say this again, because the entity cannot save your soul. The king of this world of these nations cannot save your soul. So, we have allowed the scripture to assist us in validating cities, kingdoms, and nations are all one and the same. And we've grown from just knowing to understanding that the cities, kingdoms, and nations are not necessarily subject to a person, but an entity that baits people into subjection and indebtedness. Remember, we gleaned from the 2022 Forbes magazine, right now, the nations, the kingdoms of the U.S., China, India, Germany, and Russia make up just over 71% of all the billionaires in the world and have over 40% of the world's population. But are those five nations, those five kingdoms, less than 3% of the world's nations, 3% of the world nations. Justifying the entity's extraordinary, fascinating, and financially prosperous cities, nations, and kingdoms are still enticing. They're still enticing. Nothing's changed. They're still baiting people into subjection and indebtedness. With this understanding of the purpose and importance of cities, kingdoms, and nations, and the subjugating, the conquering entity, the conquering king of them, let us show scripturally the identity of this king behind the secular nations, kingdoms of the world. The scripture tells us who it is. It's shared in both the Gospel of Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 through 10, and the Gospels of Luke chapter 4, verses 5 through 8. In these passages of scripture, Hasatan makes a statement to Yeshua that Yeshua does not challenge, that we all should understand. In these passages, Hasatan makes a statement to Yeshua that Yeshua does not challenge, and that we all should understand why he doesn't. We will first examine the Gospel of Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. So let us read. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 4, verse 8 reads, "Again, the devil taketh him." The devil taketh him, speaking of Yeshua, up into an exceeding high mountain, and showeth him, Yeshua, all the kingdoms of the world. So this is Hasatan showing Yeshua all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 4, verse 9. "And saith unto him," Hasatan saying unto Yeshua, all these things will I give thee. All these things will I give thee. Hasatan's going to give to Yeshua if thou wilt fall down and worship me. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 4, verse 10. "Then saith Yeshua unto him," Hasatan, "Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, Thou shalt worship the Lord Yahweh thy God Elohim, and him only shalt thou serve." Now, we will take our time and thoroughly examine these passages. Notice the only participants are Yeshua and Hasatan. They're the only ones in this passage. The scripture reveals Hasatan is controlling the interaction. That's what it's saying. It says Hasatan takes Yeshua into an exceeding high mountain. He's leading. And Hasatan shows Yeshua all the kingdoms, nations of the world, and the glory of them. He's in control of this conversation right here. Not that he's in control of Hasatan, he's in control of this conversation. This passage continues to show Hasatan in a position of authority in this passage. Hasatan tells Yeshua in a matter-of-fact fashion that he has authority over all the kingdoms, nations, and their glory. Scripture reveals this even more unquestionably when Hasatan tells Yeshua he will give him all these things if he will worship Hasatan. Let this sink in and meditate on this momentarily. Hasatan tells Yeshua he will give him all these things, all these kingdoms, nations, and the glory of them if he will worship Hasatan. Let this sink in and meditate on this momentarily. That scripture is revealing Hasatan has authority to give Yeshua, by whom all things were created, things of this world. Hasatan is telling Yeshua, who created all things, that he can give him something, give him things of this world. But get this. Notice Yeshua's response to Hasatan's offer. Yeshua does not challenge that Hasatan does not have the authority to do that. He never says that he doesn't have the authority to do that. Yeshua only shares what we all should do, and that says worship the Most High only, but does not say that Hasatan cannot give to whomsoever worships him. Growing and moving from just knowing to understanding this is pivotal to understanding the nations are subject to the entity of Hasatan. Growing and moving from just knowing to understanding this, that Hasatan can give to whomsoever worships him. These kingdoms and this glory of them. He can do that. Growing and moving from just knowing to understanding this is pivotal to understanding the nations are subject to the entity of Hasatan. We will now examine the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 5 through 8. It peels back even more layers for us to see unequivocally Hasatan has been given authority over the kingdoms, nations of this secular world. So let us read the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verse 5. And the devil, taking him, Yeshua, up into a high mountain, showed him, Hasatan showing Yeshua, all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. The Gospel of Luke chapter 4, verse 6. And the devil said unto him, Yeshua, all this power will I give thee, and the glory of them. But get this, for that is delivered unto me, and to whomsoever I will, I give it. Lock in on that. He says, for that is delivered unto me, and to whomsoever I will, I give it. The Gospel of Luke chapter 4, verse 7. If thou therefore wilt worship me, all shall be thine. The Gospel of Luke chapter 4, verse 8. And Yeshua answered and said unto him, Hasatan, get thee behind me, Satan, for it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord Yahweh thy God Elohim, and him only shalt thou serve. Now these scriptures, which are a different account than the Gospel of Matthew chapter 4, once again has only Yeshua and Hasatan as the participants. Similar to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 4 account, Hasatan is controlling the interaction, taking Yeshua into an exceeding high mountain, showing Yeshua all the kingdoms, nations of the world in a moment of time. This passage also shows Hasatan in a position of authority, but even more so, because in the original Greek, the phrase given up is used instead of the word delivered. Remember, he says, it is delivered unto me. But in the original Greek phrase, which this is what the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, the phrase is, instead of delivered, they use given up of the word delivered. So in the Greek, the phrase given up is normally associated with Yahweh Elohim doing the giving up. Now get this. So again, going back to words, in here they said it's been delivered unto me, but let's translate it back into the Koine Greek. It has been given up to me. But in the Greek, that phrase given up is normally associated with Yahweh Elohim doing the giving up. So understanding this gives insight into why Yeshua would not question or challenge Hasatan's statement. Because he's saying that it has been given up to me, and by him saying that, he's basically saying that Yahweh Elohim gave this to me. And to whomsoever I will, I give. So again, this is important for us to understand that this gives insight into why Yeshua would not question or challenge Hasatan's statement, both here in Luke as well as in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew 4. Now, we will not go into the details of this here, but for those that are interested, it is covered in detail in the book, The Beginning of Scriptural Truth, Volume 1 by his servant. We go into great detail of explaining how this went down. But once again, Hasatan tells Yeshua in a superior manner that authority over all the kingdoms and nations has been given up to him. And because they use that word given up to him, that means Yahweh Elohim gave it to him. And Hasatan will give Yeshua all these things if he will worship Hasatan. In Yeshua's response to Hasatan's offer and position of superiority, Yeshua does not challenge that Hasatan does not have the authority. Not in this passage either. Yeshua does not say that Hasatan cannot give to whomsoever worships him. Growing and moving from just knowing and understanding Scripture reveals the king behind all secular kingdoms and nations. It also shows how nations, like kingdoms, are subject to a king. But the real king is the entity of Hasatan. Prayerfully, this understanding will make us more spiritually aware of the unrighteous mammon treasures of this world, and that we do not allow mammon to personify and deify wealth in our lives. That we neither seek after the acquisition, the attainment of wealth, nor are we willing to become subjugated or indebted to unrighteous mammon wealth. I would like to invite you to continue to fellowship and worship the Sabbath with the Ecclesia next Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. In addition, please join the Ecclesia every Wednesday evening at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for prayer. The link for both is provided on his servant's website. Something to think about. If you're seeking a blessing, be a blessing. If this message of something to think about has been a blessing, assist us with your time, talents, and finances in continuing to grow and move from just knowing to truly understanding the word of the Most High, Yahweh Elohim. Peace and blessings.
His servant encourages you and prays that you will continue with him on the journey of growing and moving from just knowing to understanding the word of the Most High, Yahweh Elohim. To support you on your journey, his servant offers the following resources. His servant email address. Please feel free to reach out to his servant at any time with any questions, concerns, suggestions, and/or comments. His servant website and his servant YouTube channel. You are encouraged to subscribe to be alerted of new content. In addition, his servant recommends reading or listening to the beginning of Scriptural Truth, Volume 1. It affords a strong beginning foundation in not just knowing, but understanding the Scripture.